Oh, you did. Hello and welcome to this special broadcast of the Soberania podcast. I'm your co-host, José Granados, Ceja, as always, and I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, welcome to our special show. We'll introduce our guests in just a second here, but I thought we'd say hello to our audience as people jump into the live stream and start to get settled in.
Thank you very much, José Luis. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin Magazine United States, Sentido Común here in Mexico, ready for the special Sunday live edition of Soberania.
All right. And there's already lots of our friends over from the membership in the chat, getting some hellos from our friends who have joined. As always, like we said, this is a labor of love. We are volunteers here, so any little bit of support does go a long way to help us get the information out there and speak the truth about what's happening here in Mexico. And I think in particular in English, where there is such a dearth of reliable, unbiased information. So thank everybody for joining in right now. As always, if you give us a like and subscribe, and since we're going live, if you happen to be online, send a message to your friends, let them know if they want to join here on the program. So like I said, we have some special guests here today with us. A friend of the show who many of you already are familiar with, especially if you follow Mexican politics, and especially if you're a fan of La Hora de Opinar. We're a big fan of hers and everything that she has to do to stick up for the truth about the fourth transformation of Mexico on those programs. Often it seems like it's 3 against 1 on that show, including the host. We have Violeta Vázquez Rojas. She's a linguist and a political analyst, has columns in several media outlets, and of course, like I said, is a very important voice here in Mexico, speaking to what's actually happening in the country and doing so from a really, really well-argumented, well-researched. It's always a privilege to count on her being here with us on the program. Violeta, if you want to say some words saying hello here, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty after I introduce our second friend here.
Sure, José Luis. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Kurt and José Luis, and all the audience from Soberania. It's really a pleasure to be here in this very sad and sweet moment.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's a very bittersweet moment for us here, but obviously it's an appropriate time to be having this kind of conversation with the public, with analysts here with Kurt as well. I want to introduce our second guest, of course. He's a new friend of the show, Juan Pablo Morales Garza. He holds a degree of political science from the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económica, CIDE. He's also a historian from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, and he's interested in the social history of the indigenous peoples of central Mexico, which is the subject of his doctoral thesis. So, in fact, there's a lot we could say about the impact on indigenous people of this government, of the López Obrador government. And he, of course, was also a member of the magazine Sentido Común. Juan Pablo Morales Garza, thanks so much for joining us here on this special live stream. Any introductory words for our guests as people start to join the live stream?
Well, just thank you, José Luis and Kurt, for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here, and also like sharing the table with Violeta, and that I admire a lot, and just excited to talk about and sharing this moment with all of you as we comment the last hours of this great man.
It's pretty incredible. I mean, it's kind of almost difficult to take it all in, considering, right? I mean, this bittersweet sentiment, the last hours, as you said, quite literally hours at this point, just a bit about a day and a half until López Obrador, this monumental figure in Mexican politics, and not just because he was the president, not just because he's the leader of a party that is leading the transformation of Mexico, but because he played a very long role in the political scene, certainly in the parliamentary left here in Mexico. I'm just going to give you a little bit of an idea of what we want to do today. We're going to be live for about an hour. Feel free to drop in some comments and questions. We have some friends who are accompanying us and help bring some of those questions to us, and hopefully we can get those answered. But we thought we'd break it down in the following way in kind of this segment here, because there's a lot to talk about. So first, we want to talk a little bit about López Obrador's background. What's his personal history? Where did he come from? And what effect did that have on his political thought? And then later on, we want to talk about his political history. You know, he makes it onto the national scene. He starts to really become this important political figure, this leader on the left here in Mexico. And what happened in that experience there that really informed his own political thinking and his way of organizing, obviously, and also his way of governing. And then we want to talk about the president and his legacy, right? We're 2 days away from the end of his term. We're talking about his impact on this country. What really will be his legacy? What can we say about Obradorismo in general? And I think finally it'd be important because this is an English language show, and I think so many people are pretty unfamiliar with what's happening here in the country that I think there's a lot of lessons here. It's something that Kurt and I have talked a lot on the program about what are the takeaways here, because I think in a lot of ways, Mexico is an example for the world. A lot of things that people can learn from, particularly those in advanced capitalist countries who are maybe facing some of the same dilemmas that we Mexicans faced and are continuing to confront as we try to make the world a better place, our country is a better place. So we want to talk a little bit about that. So I promised I'm just here to MC. I'm just here to kind of lead the show here. I am honored to have all our guests, and especially even our co-host here, Kurt Hackbarth. There is a wealth of experience, of knowledge, of analysis here. I count myself very lucky to be able to work with people like those here joining us on the program. So, Kurt, I'll hand it over to you, and we want to keep things loose conversationally. Like I said, throw in your comments as well. Let's start with that. You know, what can we say about López Obrador's political background, his personal background? You know, where did he come from, and what did that play in terms of what we can now consider his political legacy now that he's departing sort of the public national stage?
Yeah, thank you so much, José Luis, for that introduction. I'm just going to give kind of a very brief overview of López Obrador and his personal background, and then it'll be great if when Violeta and Juan Pablo can fill in, right, some more of kind of some of the importance of this. It's funny that I think, like a lot of people in Mexico, I've been going through AMLO's most recent book, Gracias, right, which is his last book in the presidency, and then he's going to be heading off to his ranch in Chiapas to continue his work as an author post-presidency, right? So it was really interesting to go back and review the early chapters on where he came from, right? Because unlike the stereotype of the Mexico City elite presidents, right? The first very important fact about AMLO is that he doesn't come from that elite. He comes from the state of Tabasco, has the very characteristic Tabascan accent. And also, and this is very important, he came from small town Tabasco, which is the town of Tepetitan in the municipality of Macuspana, Tabasco. And the first chapters here of Gracias, he really lays out, it was almost like an island between rivers that you almost would travel more by boat than by car, right? When it flooded, when it rained, the streets would flood. They'd be out in the streets, basically in the water. His parents were shopkeepers. And what's very interesting is that, and I think this is fundamental for the AMLO that we came to know, he said that it was a very egalitarian society, this small town of Tepetitan and Macuspana, right? José Luis and I were talking about this before the program started, right? That people lived in a pretty egalitarian set of circumstances. There wasn't an excessive super rich and super poor. Probably all were living in similarly modest circumstances, which certainly shaped his worldview much differently than if he'd grown up, for example, in a place like Guanajuato, or Mexico City itself, or other parts of the country where class differences are much more clearly demarcated. He was also, as he pointed out, kind of by default, a very liberal place, not liberal in the US sense, but liberal in the sense of it wasn't particularly a religious place. It wasn't a key part of the conquest. Tabasco was kind of, off to the side there. So again, it wasn't part of those big cities that had a big Catholic presence, which were the big, industrial or mining centers where the Spanish families had existed. So interestingly, AMLO grew up in egalitarian circumstances and in also quite tolerant liberal circumstances in the sense of not being a religious center, right? We're talking about Tabasco in the 50s, right? Again, important, right? Because it's funny that the English language media kind of would sneer at AMLO that, oh, of course he likes dirty fuels, and of course he likes fossil fuels because he grew up in Tabasco, which has all the oil. And I think that's not really the takeaway for AMLO. That's not that he grew up near oil. It's that he grew up in small town Mexico in egalitarian circumstances, right? Where the kind of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church was not as much in power, right? So that's important. Then kind of jumping ahead, and we can fill in other details as we go, right? His parents were shopkeepers. They went through economic tough times. Their shop went out of business. He went for a time to Villahermosa, and then got a scholarship to go and study political science at the National Autonomous University of Mexico City in this very crucial year of 1973. Now, this is important because this was the Mexico of the 1960s and 70s, where, as he points out in his book, I think 9 out of 10 people who applied to the public university system got in, if I'm not mistaken there. I mean, the rate of people getting applied, because that was the idea, right? The idea of a public university system open to all, right? Especially, people from outside of the city as well. And actually, AMLO came to live in the Tabasco House in Mexico City, which would, where they would provide housing and food for students from the States to come and study at the UNAM. Something that changed radically in the neoliberal era, when I think it went down to about 1 in 10 Mexicans would be accepted into the public university system, always with the excuse that you didn't pass the exam. Well, they passed the exam back in the 60s and 70s. So, this was another example of, AMLO being a product of his times, in the sense that the public university system was open to him, that it wasn't to a lot of people in future generations. And that's been actually part of the struggle of the Cuatro T, the fourth transformation, to, build again a public university system that had been denuded. Of course, I think a lot of our listeners will understand this importance of 1973, because it was, I think in his first weeks of his first semester at the UNAM, Salvador Allende is overthrown in Chile. And this is, talk about, creating your worldview, right? This really marked, as we know, right, the ascent of the Chicago Boys, the Nixon strategy of coups, which then led to a whole series of dictatorships throughout South America, and many of whose refugees came to live in Mexico, right? So it certainly ended the optimism, perhaps, of the generation of the decades previous, that a parliamentary left could make its way into power. Of course, there had already been the Arbans overthrow in Guatemala in 1954, and Brazil and such, right? But Chile was really, 1973 in a sense was kind of the high water mark of post-war Keynesianism, as we know. Anyway, so I think what we're going to see from AMLO and his generation is the fundamental question of how can the left take power and not get overthrown in a coup? How can the left take power and remain in power, right? And this question is all the more important for Mexico, which has the U.S. right above it, right? So on this last segment, we'll talk about, I think, how AMLO managed relationships with the U.S. throughout his term. Just to the last few days, when AMLO took the Calixa quarry, the very contaminating quarry over in the Yucatan, and declared it a natural protected area, right? So AMLO's last maneuver, and has gotten U.S. Congress people furious. So that's just to the last days of his presidency, right? So I just wanted to put those few things out there, and then hand the baton over as a few of the kind of opening motifs to start with.
Juan Pablo, Violeta, whoever wants to jump in here, let us know
Or
what
if
you
I
think.
may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Definitely there's a lot of biographical details in AMLO's own biography that are relevant. But I think if we frame all of these details in a broader historical trajectory, I think what is crucial for AMLO is that he was not only born, but he was politicized when he was in high school and then later in college, in a very particular moment also in Mexican history, that the PRI was the ruling party. It was the same party that won the revolution, and something that is key in an international level is that in Latin America, only Cuba and Mexico had social revolutions and regimes born out of those revolutions in the 20th century. And so that would really make a big difference from Mexico vis-a-vis, for instance, all the Southern Cone. So AMLO was born and was politicized in the 60s and early 70s, in a moment where the Mexican Revolution, or the last wave of revolutionary action coming from General Lázaro Cárdenas, was coming to an end. A little bit, if maybe the comparison is not totally fair and exact, but something like what we see in the US with the New Deal in the 70s, like a war against unions, welfare state, and so on. So I think for Andrés Manuel, this is very important. In the moment that he's getting politicized, he's witnessing all these social leaders belonging to the party that were at some points reference of the Cardenista movement or the revolution, that are being bashed or trashed or persecuted, even murdered. So I think that left a huge imprint in the way he started building his worldview. And of course, I think for him, what Allende symbolizes is the violent interruption of a democratic mandate. That for him, like if we then go back and really study all these key moments in his political biography, that will be essential. Like, stay close to a democratic mandate. Doesn't matter if it's small or large, like a country, like winning a presidential election. But that mandate is sacred, I think. And so I would frame put that framework out.
Excellent. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. This idea that I think is really going to emerge as we discuss his history, everything that led up to the presidency and his actual exercise of power, this sticking to the mandate of being close to the people. You know, it's often a term that is misused, I would say, to be generous, this idea of a populism, but of this idea of actually being close to the masses, of actually resonating within them and also advocating for them on a nonstop basis, of this idea that the exercise of power is about bringing the interests of the masses, of the population, into the halls of government. And I think that's one of the things that, for me, certainly sets him apart. Violeta, I'd be more than happy to hear from you in terms of, what are the important things of his upbringing that you think ended up playing a pretty big part in terms of his own development of his ideology?
Well, I agree with Kurt in this very important fact that AMLO, as opposed to other presidents in Mexico, does not come from the elite. However, I would like to point out something that Federico Navarrete, another very famous historian in Mexico, has said, I think very accurately, which is AMLO is certainly not the first, how would you say, like the first president that comes from the people, that does not come from the elite. He's not the first one, but he is the first one that has not concealed it. And that makes a difference between, because maybe Cedillo would, like other presidents might have a more popular background, but they would always pretend that they were something else. And this, the fact that the AMLO never concealed it, never disguised it into anything else, is also, I think, part of his personal signature, the signature of just being honest and being close to the people, because being from coming from a state in the South, one of those regions that have been historically forgotten, is not a bad thing. You know, it's not, this is not something to be ashamed of, but actually at the end, it's going to be something to take pride on. So I think that that part of his history is actually linked to his honesty, and that as a watermark of all of his political career. And I would like to connect everything that you guys have been saying to a second stage in the discussion, which is the key political moments, but in which, you know, that have determined the destiny, or whatever, like the decisions that have come next. And I think there are, well, if we take the background of AMLO in Tabasco, and there's a very nice moment described in this book, Gracias, where they are demonstrating against the fraud in the Tabasco governmental elections. And so all the people have already agreed to come to Mexico City, you know, for a demonstration. So he's leading like a column of people that want to walk. This is like 500 kilometers or so from Tabasco to Mexico City. And they are going to walk for days and days. But in the middle of it, they have already come to an agreement. And someone has agreed from Secretaría de Gobernación or something like that. I can't remember the passage very well because I read it some months ago. My memory is very bad. But the thing is, they came to an agreement, and at that precise moment, they could have just quit the demonstration. They could have just quit the caravan. But he decided not to, because the people in his caravan were so excited to come to Mexico City and visit the Basilica, and some of them wanted to go to Zócalo, and he couldn't just disappoint all these people, and so he decided to keep walking. And I think that's a very nice moment in the narration, because it shows you how he's not only politically committed, but he's also committed to whatever emotions and illusions come from the political movement itself. And he's very sensitive to, you know, to people's actual ideas of what they want to do, and you know, and he doesn't want to disappoint. And so I think that is one of his main moments, el éxodo por la democracia. And the other one, of course, which I think is fundamental for most of us, and Juan Pablo here, I'm sorry to call him Juancho, but that's the way I call him because we're friends. But he's not going to let me lie about it. I think it's the foundational moment for a big part of this generation that supports AMLO and that supports now Claudia Sheinbaum. It's the time of the desafuero, when he was impeached, and you know, with the intention that he would not run for president, and the impeachment took place in 2005. And I think, for me, that is the foundational moment of Obradorismo, because López Obrador, of course, has a trajectory that goes back several years, but that the breakthrough moment in the history of Obradorismo for me is that day of April in 2005, in which people just gathered in Zócalo and opposed his impeachment. And I think that that's one of the main points in the history of Obradorismo, and I'll just give the turn to someone else if you want to talk more about that.
I think that's the perfect segue, to be honest, right? We want to shift here, talk a little bit about, López Obrador once he's exercising political power. And here we're talking about while he was jefe de gobierno, often that's translated into mayor of Mexico City, but I don't think that actually quite captures it, right? I think it's more level of a governor, right? So the governor of Mexico City, ruling over the economic, political heart of Mexico as a leftist leader elected to that. It's actually where Claudia Sheinbaum first enters political life as well as the Secretary of the Environment. And there's a lot we could say about his period as jefe de gobierno, as governor, but I do think that it's worthwhile to explore a couple of key moments. And I think we can start with that one there, which is the desafuero, which is a term in Spanish, which is the impeachment. Basically, politicians in Mexico used to have political immunity. And in order to prosecute them, they had to withdraw that political immunity. And there was clearly a politicized attempt to take away his immunity in order to keep him from being able to run for the presidency in 2006. Now, we know he did run, and then there was a fraud, which I think is the other element that I think is very important in terms of the development of Obradorismo. But if anybody wants to jump in here on what is the impact of the desafuero, and I think more importantly, the popular response, right? The mobilization, the masses going to the streets and saying, we will not tolerate this abuse of our democracy.
I'll start a little bit. I did want to fill in one more little piece of AMLO before, which I think is important to mention before we go forward, and that was his time as the state director of the INI, right, the Indigenous Institute there in Tabasco. I'm actually was just looking over this chapter, and he was saying that living that close to this fraternity and this solidarity made me more human, and it made me a part of the politician that I am. That is to say that AMLO's first job out of college was to go back to Tabasco, and he was working with the Chantal community in Tabasco in development projects, irrigation projects in Tabasco. And he was there for a full period, 5 to 6 years. They did irrigation works, and he was saying that he really learned so much from the assembly process of how they deliberated and came to decisions. And that's important. I mean, I live in Oaxaca. I've lived in Oaxaca for 23 years. And so there are a lot of municipalities in Oaxaca that don't have a political party system, that have what's called usos y costumbres in Mexico, which is basically kind of a town meeting style democracy, a deliberative democracy. And so there's another piece in the AMLO puzzle there, was his time of the state director of the INI in Tabasco, working with those Chantal communities and seeing, how local development projects could be built from the bottom up. So to go to the desafuero, for those members of the public who weren't following Mexican politics at the time, in 1997 there was the democratic opening in Mexico City, where Mexico City gets its first democratic mayor before there had been an appointed leader from the federal government. So it gets its democratic mayor, and that was in the person of Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, a historical leader of the left. Right. And AMLO becomes basically the second elected mayor / governor of Mexico City in the year 2000. Right? In Mexican politics, mayor of Mexico City is traditionally a trampoline or a jumping point or has become that, to a presidential candidacy. And we see here that AMLO's term in Mexico City was very successful precisely because he really worked out many of the programs that we were again going to see on the national level, including, the universal adult pension, right, scholarship and other programs, which we can go into. So what you see is a concerted effort by the Vicente Fox government to get him out of the way, right? Especially after the PRD does really well in the midterm elections of 2003. So the way they trumped it up was, we're going to strip AMLO of his political immunity on a bogus charge, just a bogus charge, that he had disobeyed a court order, right? We see this, now with the whole judicial reform issue in Mexico, where, the courts throw out these bogus charges in an attempt to, say someone has, disobeyed a court order. And in this case, the irony was it was a court order supposedly to stop AMLO from building a road to a hospital. to a hospital. So the Congress actually did vote to strip him of his political immunity. And in Mexican law, if you're, if you have charges brought up against you, you can't run for office. So it was a way to keep him off the ballot. He was actually on his way to go to jail. It was that close. It was that close, right? That it's like, and nobody posed bail for me. He said, I'm going to jail. And if they're going to put me in jail, then I'm going to be in jail, right? And it was just a question of, hours before he was imprisoned on this bogus charge to, in front of the world, that basically they pulled the plug on the whole Desafuero thing and dropped the charges, right? But at that point, Vicente Fox and, his whole coterie were so humiliated because Fox had to go on a national television. He had to go on national television and walk back what he just tried to do. He was humiliated. He was determined then that if he couldn't keep AMLO off the ballot, he was going to defeat him in a fraud. And that led to the 2006 election, just to give that context to people. And that was, when you see this massive outpouring of support for AMLO, which we would then see going forward in successive years. So just to give some of that context.
Yeah, and I mean, I would like to also provide a little bit of, well, I mean, in a very humble way, context about how and why Andrés Manuel faced the impeachment, the desafuero, with such a strength, political strength. And to understand that, let's go back a few years into the 80s again, and pick up what Kurt was talking, his first job. Essentially, he was a bureaucrat from the regime. And it's very interesting because his position was like some sort of like developer or an administrative role to develop, quote unquote, develop indigenous communities or bring development into indigenous communities. So one very interesting conclusion that we can draw from that experience is that his idea of not only development and modernization, but also how organizing people around a project, an idea, can become the base for like larger political demands. So his approach was not like a top-down perspective, but instead organizing with the people in this town hall kind of assemblies, as Kurt mentioned, and from there, then in a way like a bottom-up perspective. That would be a similar strategy that he deployed in the 90s against another neoliberal fraud called FOBAPROA, which was the privatization of, well, actually the opposite, was the making public private debts for
the
like
bank bailout, right?
banks and corporations.
Yeah.
So in the 80s and 90s, he showcased like two strengths, how to be a grassroots organizer and as being part of the regime. And then second, his experience as a political strategist. So it's very interesting that in the peak of the neoliberal policies embodied by Cedillo in the late 90s, Andrés Manuel was able to weave a set of political alliances that launched Mexican left into, I mean, probably Andrés Manuel won more governorships and seats in Congress than any other leftist leader thus far. So by the time that he faced the Desafuero in 2005, he had already showcased like extensive experience on how to organize people, how to mobilize, and how to weave strategies with other political leaders that over the years he brought into his own coalition. So yeah, I mean, I just want to mention that because somehow it's very like, otherwise it's very hard to understand why an outsider was able to confront the system and come out victorious.
I'd love to throw that to Violeta and Kurt, whoever wants to jump in here. What is the place of AMLO, the organizer, in his exercise of power? How did we see somebody from the grassroots who was used to knocking on doors, who wore out the soles of his shoes and actually going out and meeting directly into the homes of the people in this country? How was that translate into some of his, when he was mayor of Mexico City, governor of Mexico City, but also now to transition a little bit of the conversation into what was AMLO, the organizer, like in the presidency? Does anyone want to jump in here first? Violeta, we'll go with you.
To jump in, but if he doesn't, then I'll take it. Well, I think this is very important what Juan Pablo has been saying, and actually I think I might say something that is not very politically correct, but I think that the whole story is not written yet. And one of the points that we are going to be discussing in the next maybe years is going to be what is the role of the indigenous political culture in the Mexican state political culture, and how it has transformed the state. And I think I am not a specialist in this, and so I already expressed my apologies to Juan Pablo, who actually is an expert in this, but I am not. But I do think that there are at least two ways in which we can see the influence of the indigenous people's political thought in the development of everything that has come about in the last years and that we are actually experiencing now through the presidency of López Obrador. And one of the positions is the one that is more that is closest to the Zapatist, or one of the versions of the Zapatist army and the indigenous movement, the so-called indigenous movement, that call for not only for the autonomy of indigenous peoples, but also for it is this idea that the indigenous peoples have been somehow co-opted by the state, and that their history and their destiny should be something set apart from the Mexican state. That is one position to take. And then the other position is more like AMLO's. Like there is the indigenous peoples and cultures are what sustains this nation as a project, and their political culture and habits and everything has to be taken in as the way we also can reconcile with democracy. And that has, as Juancho just said, that has made the signature of AMLO's way of governing. And I agree with this. And I think that, I mean, I'm not an expert, as I said, and there might be a lot more details to discuss, but I think that in the center of all this, there's going to be the role of indigenous peoples, not only as history, but also as live actors and sources from which the Mexican state and the Mexican society has learned to to develop a certain form of democracy. And I think that the issue is important to such an extent that AMLO's main project when he retires is to write a book about it, and about how this country has its own character, that the character that determines the difference between Mexico and the rest of the world actually comes from there, emerges from its political, from its indigenous cultures and all that, let's say that the cultural substance of the nation. But yeah, I'll give the word to Kurt if he wants to say more about it.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in a little bit on that. And it's funny that, this is something that's very current right now in Mexico, very, very current, right? For two reasons. First of all, they just passed a constitutional reform just a few days ago, which grew out of the San Andreas Accords of the 1990s, which were never passed, right, at the time of the Zapatista conflict, to make indigenous and Afro-Mexican communities subjects of public rights, which is kind of a mouthful. But what it basically means is that indigenous and Afro-Mexican communities will have more legal standing and autonomy to make decisions about their own territories, and that their own form of governance, this kind of town meeting governance that we've talked about, has full legal recognition, right? We can go more into that, but that's the essence of it. So that's one thing. And the second is, and I think we see it, there's a question here. Thank you for all your questions. By Eric Tellez, he said on the supposed socialist Spaniards backing their kings. And this is something that's happening just now, right? Where there's a diplomatic dispute between Mexico and Spain, dating back to the first year of AMLO's presidency, when AMLO sent a very diplomatic letter to the King of Spain, saying that in the upcoming year, which is going to be the bicentennial, right, that they could work together in concert to address the historic wrongs, visited upon the indigenous peoples in Mexico, right, and they could do something, in concert to lead to a public apology for what had happened. King never answered and filtered the letter to the press. Right? And then they all started, basically gangpiling on that, right? The Spanish conservatives and writers and such. Right? So now it came time for Claudia Sheinbaum to, she's going to be inaugurated next Tuesday. She decided to invite the head of government, right, Pablo Sanchez, and not the head of state, the king, if he can't answer a letter. Right? And so, of course, all this back and forth, right, and all this kind of offense taken by Spain. But to get to the point of this, just a day or so ago, Claudia Sheinbaum and AMLO were at a ceremony where they are repairing the historic, or what you can do to repair the historical harm visited upon the Yaqui people of Mexico, right? Back in the time of the Porfirio Diaz dictatorship, when they were forcibly displaced from their land in the north, and many were sent to be semi-slaves in the Yucatan. So part of AMLO's legacy is giving land back to the Yaquis and irrigation projects, and it's an important deal that hasn't gotten the attention it probably should have, right? And actually, Claudia Sheinbaum laid it out in a very, I think, eloquent set of comments, basically modeling behavior for Spain, basically saying, look what the Mexican government can do with its own history, alluding to that Spain hasn't taken up that gauntlet, and saying that the force of this asking for forgiveness, or pedir perdón, right, for historical wrongs, is something that has a dignifying force. It makes you stronger. It engrandece el pueblo. It makes you a greater people. Right? So that's by way of saying that this is a very relevant topic right now in Mexico, right? So very briefly, going back to how AMLO has organized this. So following the desafuero, there was the 2006 electoral fraud. That is a moment when the moment could have crumbled. The movement could have crumbled right there after that. right? Because that 2006 electoral fraud was so traumatic for people. That could have been the end right there. And actually, the powers that be did everything they could to make it the end. If you were living in Mexico at the time, you couldn't see AMLO on television after the 2006 electoral fraud. He was erased, right? Once the actual post-electoral dispute was, over and he was no longer an official candidate, he was erased from television. He was erased. And you didn't have the social media in 2006 that we have now to, go around that. And actually, that's why, and I think there's another important thing about AMLO, he was very early on, he saw the potential of social media before probably most other world leaders or, future world leaders, right? Who had their own team and whatever, got to it later. So you would have Radio AMLO and TV AMLO on, social media. I had a blog at the time, back when blogs were, that's still a thing. This was way ahead of the curve on a lot of other countries in doing that. And so you see now Mexico has a really extensive social media ecosystem, much more than many English-speaking countries. Right? So that's an important thing. So then, they had to build back after that 2006 fraud, and I don't want to extend too much, so I apologize. But I have a little quick anecdote. At the time of the midterm elections of 2009, AMLO was very much on the defensive. He was touring the country. He was speaking to maybe crowds of 10 or 20 people in small towns. He was visiting every municipality in the country. What we'd call in English his wilderness years, but it goes way beyond that. And he came to Oaxaca one night in the 2009 campaign. For those who are living in Mexico, we remember, right, that there was this whole thing that they were trying to get Clara Brugada elected as a delegate in Mexico City, who is now the mayor-elect, but we couldn't vote for her. Well, I was in Oaxaca, but couldn't vote for her because they did a thing with the ballot, so you had to vote for somebody else called Juanito so that she could. So it was a strange, hard, difficult time, and the movement was very much on the defensive, right? So AMLO showed up in Oaxaca one night. And it was late, and he arrived late, and it wasn't even in the Zocalo, it was up the Alcala a bit. And there were maybe, I don't know, 20, 30 of us. Maybe 10 o'clock at night. I thought he's gonna come and talk for a few minutes and bail out of here. There's nobody here. He came and he gave a barn burner of a speech. 45 minutes. The whole thing for 30 of us, maybe, at 10 o'clock at night. For midterm elections when he wasn't even on the ballot, we wanted to make sure that the Workers' Party at that time didn't lose their public financing. Right? So anyway, that always stuck with me. So he comes out of the wilderness years, runs again in 2012. And that time, the fraud was a different kind of fraud. It wasn't so much a fraud in the ballot box. It was a fraud through buying votes, very literally with debit cards, right? Prepaid debit cards to buy votes, right? Amongst other things. Weathers that and gets to the presidency. And I think maybe I'll leave it off here because I think I probably talked too much, but we should probably at the end, talk about how all of this organizing from the time of the INE, from the time as the head of the PRD, at the time of Fobaproa, from the time of weathering two frauds, how does that then come into the presidency? Maybe we should transition to that.
Sure. All right, so I want to say hello to everybody in the chat. Thanks so much for staying engaged with us, especially to those who have been dropping some super chats. Appreciate that very much. Helps to keep the program going. Thank you so much for your support and for tuning in. We got a couple of shout outs there. We have someone saying, I love Violeta. Hi, Violeta, as well. So some questions, keep the questions coming. We're going to handle those a little bit at the end. We'll try to see if we can squeeze them in. But I wanted to build on a little bit that was just said here, right? Around what López Obrador was talking about, the place of sort of the pre-Hispanic, the pre-Columbian Mexico. And actually just a few days ago, he said the following: now that I'm retiring, the hypothesis that I want to convert into a thesis is that the good that the Mexicans have today, in large part, we inherited it from pre-Hispanic Mexico. And so it is something that is very much kind of an incorporating of those historical elements, right? I mean, it's no mistake. This is called the fourth transformation of Mexico, making a deliberate attempt to tie into those historical moments of great political change in this country, but also rescuing sort of the pre-Hispanic tradition and things like that. Juan Pablo here might agree with me. One of the most famous quotes from José Carlos Mariátegui, who's a thinker that I'm a big fan of, Peruvian Marxist, quite a really advanced thinker for his time, used to say that Indo-American socialism cannot be an imitation or a copy. It must be a historic creation. And I think here in Mexico, we've seen a lot of sort of original application of political ideas. I was reviewing an essay by Edwin Ackerman, who I'm a big fan of as well. Highly recommend his work if you want to learn about Mexico and the Fourth Transformation in English. He's a professor, writes in English. But he was writing about the López Obrador's political struggle, the way that he kind of redefined the anti-corruption struggle as a democratic one, of kind of reckoning with the fact that the anti-establishment position in Mexico's so-called democratic transition was one that was very much tied to a neoliberal program of the privatization of services and the privatization of state industries, et cetera, et cetera. And sort of the way that López Obrador's political project has kind of turned that on its head, right? About rescuing the place of the state in the economy, to directly intervene in the economy, about state-owned initiatives. Obviously, we can speak to a certain really important ones that he accomplished in his mandate, which was, of course, the rescue of Pemex. The state oil company was deliberately being left to rust in order to facilitate its privatization, to open up Mexico's energy markets to transnational capital. We saw that as well with other energy interests in this country, with the generation of electricity, the nationalization of lithium. But I think another element that I think is worth really highlighting here, that in a way wasn't, I would say, in sort of the classic Marxist sense of the rescue of class politics and the centrality of class politics, but we've certainly seen it. What we've seen is a reorganization of the electorate, whereas before the kind of the organic leadership that would emerge out of the campesinos, out of the peasants, out of the working class would very much be co-opted by this corporatist structure that existed in the 20th century in Mexico under the leadership of the PRI, but now, has reconfigured it. I think we can very much say that the working class today is with Morena, and it votes for Morena. And I think that speaks to a large part also why they have so much support as well in elections and have been able to strengthen their mandate in this last election. So I wanted to turn it over to our guests here and to Kurt as well. But we'll start with Juan, since we haven't heard from him in a bit, in terms of what do you think about what are the major takeaways of the López Obrador presidency in the sense of how has it remade politics in Mexico?
Well, and I think his main contribution, for without question, is that he ended up, and I use his words, with the República Simulada, or the mocked republic. I don't know how, like an accurate translation. And that's interesting because it resonates with a concept in political science that it's the anti-democratic liberalism. And I think you could fairly characterize the transition period, let's say that from 2000 up to 2018, as liberalism that was not democratic, that probably people had some liberties like expression or property, so on, but the main decisions that essentially characterized democracy were restricted. And I think AMLO gave back that power to the people. That actually it's the name of your podcast, the Soberania. He regained the sovereignty for the people, because before, the real exercise of power was not in the people, was in a small committee, as AMLO would call it, of stakeholders. And actually stakeholders because they saw the administration or management of the country as a private interest. So I think his main contribution, but legacy for the years to come, and also I would say lesson for probably countries in South America, is that like an expansion of popular politics.
What are, Violeta or Kurt, you want to jump in here on this segment? You know, we can kind of mix them up a little bit here. You know, what are some of the major takeaways of the López Obrador government, what it's going to be, its legacy, and then maybe we can start talking about lessons for the rest of the world. I see a comment here from one of our supporters saying, one of the great things about Morena, in my opinion, is that it's a left party that actually acts like a left party. The socialist parties in Europe have totally forgotten to even think about the people. So we'll go with Kurt first, and then move over to Violeta. Kurt, your thoughts on what is the major takeaways of the López Obrador government? What are the things that are really going to have that long-term impact on public life in this country?
Well, 6 years and 6 minutes. You know, there's a laundry list of policies, you know, which I've talked about on other programs, and we've also talked about on the podcast. So I think the first batch of them is the social policies, right? Which is you know, pension, disability allowance, stay in school scholarships, aid to single mothers, you know, the Sembrando Vida, the tree planting program, Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, right, which is an apprenticeship program for students, which has just been made constitutional. So there's a whole batch of social programs. Mexico never had these things. Mexico never had these things. Right? Or if they had them, they were in a corporatist sense of, you know, through the PRI, and the sense of, you know, buying votes, you know, and buying allegiances, but never as universal programs that are rights, right? And that's also been part of the discourse of Claudia Sheinbaum. These are not, you know, these are not giveaways. These are not anything else. These are rights. These are rights that you have, and they should be universal. Right? So there's the batch of social programs, right? Then there's been the whole work on infrastructure, right? Mexico's infrastructure had been totally denuded to the neoliberal era. So you see the rescue of Pemex. You see bringing back the train system, which now Claudia Sheinbaum has promised to extend, right? You see the building of a refinery and the purchasing of another refinery in Texas. All of this to make Mexico energy self-sufficient. Because you can't have an independent foreign policy if you're not energy self-sufficient, because then the United States could just turn off the tap. You just turn off the tap on your gasoline. Then you'd have, you know, when I think the statistic was when AMLO came to power, Mexico had 5 days worth of gasoline stored. So, you know, if the United States were to just turn the tap off, you know, what do you do if you don't have your own refining capacity in the roads? That goes along with, of course, green energy programs like the largest solar installation up in Sonora, the nationalization of lithium, which of course is very important, and so on. But all within a sovereignty framework. A third batch we can talk about has everything to do with foreign policy. And that means reasserting Mexico's, you know, traditional role as kind of we don't want to say a big brother in Latin America, because, you know, it's about having horizontal relationships and not hierarchical ones. But as kind of a, you know, a regional leader, which had been kind of, you know, frittered away in previous decades. So you see AMLO sending a plane to rescue Evo Morales after the 2019 coup. You see AMLO calling a spade in Peru with what happened there. You see AMLO sticking up for Mexico when Ecuador invaded the Mexican embassy there with Noboa, right? You see, you know, Mexico once again taking on this role. And you also see it with regards to Mexico's attempts to get more control over its electrical framework, right? It's, you know, the Federal Electricity Commission, which is on the par with what's going on with Pemex. And so then you had the American ambassador, Ken Salazar, saying, oh, we don't like this. We don't like Mexico having control over its electricity network. We want the multinationals to be able to cannibalize the grid. So you basically have a series of circumstances where AMLO had to tell the U.S. ambassador basically to butt out. One of them was the electricity reform, and one of them was this judicial reform just recently when Kellen Salazar again is like, oh, we don't like this. It's like, well, it's really none of your business. You know, it's not any of your business, right? And so sticking up for Mexico in that sense, there was the national security law, which limits the activities of intelligence agencies on Mexican soil. That made the DEA so upset that the Drug Enforcement Agency, they started leaking stuff to the press, and there was a whole campaign on social media to try to portray AMLO as Narco AMLO and Narco Claudia, coming out of DEA leaks because they're so furious about that. So that's where I think we can talk about that: social programs, infrastructure, and foreign policy. And just one more thing, which I think is very important. I think none of that, what I just said, would have been important without what I'm going to say now, is controlling the media. Not controlling them directly, but controlling the message. Having, message discipline. AMLO has always had very clear message discipline, but he learned. He learned from being mayor of Mexico City. He learned from presidential campaigns that if you don't have a media strategy, they will destroy you. Like they did to Sanders, like they did to Corbyn, like Pablo Iglesias. They will destroy you. And they'll eat you up, and they'll be very happy doing it. So the Mañanera, the morning press conference, right? As Iglesias himself said, this is something that's going to be studied in theses for years. Having a daily press conference for 2 to 3 hours to all comers to set the message and to finally put these vultures of corporate media on the defensive for once. Nothing else would have been possible without that.
Violeta, I want to turn it over to you. So we've reached the 1 hour mark, and maybe we were a little bit too ambitious thinking that we were going to be able to talk about all of this in such a short amount of time. There really is. We could go on for all day. But I did want to make sure we still have time. And if our guests don't mind sticking around a little bit longer, we'll keep going. I know there's a lot of questions in the chat, so we can handle those at the end as well in case our guests need to go. They're busy people. We really do appreciate them being here with us. But to get back on the agenda, Violeta, your thoughts on López Obrador's legacy and lessons for anybody who, like us, dream of making the world a better place.
So to be honest, I hadn't thought about López Obrador's last days in office, because for the last maybe a week or so, I've been in denial. Like I don't really want to think that this is actually ending. So I've refused to think about these matters, and I am really happy that I am thinking about this out loud with you guys and with the audience and their questions. And my feeling is that this is turning out to be a lot more complex than we thought. Not only because it is going to be extensive and hard to relate the whole thing, like Kurt just said, 6 years in 6 minutes, that is going to be already a hard task. But also, what are the relevant questions, right? Like, what should we be asking ourselves about everything that happened in these last 6 years? And so I would like to summarize. Well, this is not a real summary, but just to make some points that for me condense most of the things that I think are dispersed in several ways of looking at this whole government in 6 years. Not only the 6 years, but the whole social movement that came before, and that ended up in this government, and that is going to continue, which is also something that I think is unusual. But the first thing I would like to say about this is that I think there are several things that López Obrador taught us, or his government taught us. For instance, they taught us that the people who govern should be just as the people who are governed. And that is the concept behind austerity, Republican austerity, which is not just, Margaret Thatcher's austerity. Republican austerity means governors and governees should be equal. Like people should, the people in the government should resemble the people who they govern. And for that matter, they shouldn't be, ostentatious and, incredibly rich in front of these people. So that is, I think, a revolutionary concept, because it has to do more with equality than with savings. The other thing, so there are so many other things, like, for instance, and there is a question in the messages about the fight for corruption, and just like Juan Pablo, but also Kurt had pointed out, the fight for corruption is seen as the core of this whole fourth transformation. The fourth transformation, and AMLO has said it several times, if I have to say it standing in one foot, I would say this is the fight against corruption. But the fight against corruption implies a whole conception of what corruption is. And corruption is nothing else but to pass the public wealth into private hands. That is what corruption means. So neoliberalism is, in essence, a corrupted system. So the fight for corruption is actually the fight against neoliberalism. So anyway, I could go on and try to make a list of all the things that his government and his way of seeing things have changed. But I would like to say one thing to condense all this, and it is the following. Since I am not very old, or so I think, but I've been through several breakthrough moments in the history of Mexico. I've been through, like, I was a student in the National School of Anthropology when the Ejército Zapatista stayed there, and we received them, and they were addressing the Congress in 2001. I went through the strike at UNAM in 1999, and so many other things. The transition to democracy, or so-called transition to democracy in 2000. Even the electoral fraud in 1998, and I've seen so many things happen, and I've seen the people of Mexico having their hopes totally invested in those crucial moments. Not to forget 2010, in actually a movement that emerged in Cuernavaca, which is my hometown, against the drug war, which was also one of the questions addressed in the messages. And that was a movement brought about by a poet. So everybody had hopes in that, like finally the people was going to unite against all that evil power that had been pushing against us for so many years. But the truth is, none of those movements actually had a significant outcome. None of those things that were our hopes in all those moments actually developed into something meaningful. The only one that did was López Obrador's movement. And for me, that is the most significant legacy of his, which is giving the people not only hope, but actually the proof that hope can turn into reality. And reality is not great, reality is not perfect, and reality has a lot of things, a lot of failures, and a lot of, reality is always perfectible. But as Leibniz would say, it is the best of worlds, because it is the one we actually live in, right? So there might be other better worlds to which we can aim, but the fact that this may be imperfect, maybe perfectible idea of what is social justice, of the idea of sovereignty, idea of you know, republicanism, or what you like, actually can be brought to real life. I think that is the legacy of López Obrador, that hope can become reality. And that, I think, to instill that in a nation, in a people, I think that is that makes that people undefeatable. And I think that's what we get from him.
That's incredible. What a excellent way of summarizing. I think sometimes we can think about López Obrador, and as what we tried to do here on this program is, what we're talking about is not just 6-year term and what he was able to do, but everything that kind of led into it, in a way that his government in these last 6 years was a synthesis of that lifetime of experience, of humble origins, of being close to the people, of doing the hard work of organizing, of continuing to press on in the hardest of circumstances, and then actually showing what change can look like. There's a question here that I saw, I want specific, what methods has Morena done to make its program acceptable to Mexico's majority to vote them in, right? And I think a lot of it is actually delivering. I really, really appreciate that analysis that Violeta just provided with us of what does it look like? I mean, Mexico shares a long border with the United States. Yet here, what we're trying to do isn't just to build a welfare state, but it's actually to conceive of what does a state that is trying to build an alternative to neoliberalism, not maybe a post-neoliberal society. What does it actually look like? How do you actually deliver things for people? Well, this is one example of it, and one that has been tremendously successful, and not just in electoral terms, not just being able to be reelected, but actually delivering things, right? López Obrador obviously is reflecting a lot himself on, his last few days, and very recently said, I leave with a sense of accomplishment, of calm, because we lifted almost 10 million people out of poverty, right? Because we increased people's purchasing power, because, there's a point that is often made on all of these shows of a political analysis of just actually kind of humbling ourselves and remembering, these universal rights-based programs. So for some families, it means the difference between eating meat or not that month. I mean, that's what we're talking about in a country like Mexico. And why I think a lot of these things are actually directly addressing the very immediate needs of the population, but also doing it in a very politicized context, right? Kurt talked about the mañaneras and its role in the communications exercise of this government as well. So for people understanding that, this isn't just the good graces of government doing, this is a struggle, and it was the product of decades of people organizing. Like I said, we have a lot of questions here in the chat. I'm more than happy to walk through them. But if our guests have to leave, we totally understand. If they want to stick around, help us answer some of these questions as well. But before we get to that, I want to give an opportunity to everybody but myself to give a couple of parting words here in terms of AMLO's legacy. Maybe in the form of a question, right? Can it be said that now, this coming Tuesday, with López Obrador stepping down and President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum taking office, are we entering a period of Obradorismo, right? I'm a scholar of Venezuela, and there we talk a lot about Chavismo, right? This larger-in-life political leader who ends up creating a movement that takes on his last name. Can it be said that now Mexico is going to enter this era of Obradorismo, and what would that mean for politics in this country? We'll go with Juan Pablo, Kurt, and then we'll go back to the questions here and try to answer some of the ones you've posed for us here in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, like a quick response would be yes, because people is already using the term. So I have a really hard time imagining that in the future, that's not a reference. And in a similar way that people, I mean, probably it's not an academic concept, but but people like in a very in daily language talk about Cardenismo. And I mean, those older generations, like my grandmother who lived through Cardenismo, really knew what it meant. So I think like a similar phenomena, it's about to occur. And as for the legacy, I think some of the like a few hints are already noticeable. That I remember one probably like very clever question before. I think it was before the election of 2018. One journalist asked him if he would make constitutional amendments or even a constitutional assembly to replace or to form a new constitution, given that many other leftist experiments like Chavez attempted to do so in the early 2000s. And his response was that he considered it was not necessary, that the legal framework was enough. But at the end, he's leaving office with a totally reshaped political system, not only because the popularity and success of Morena in electoral terms vanished, the existing or the former party system, but also right now we are witnessing the reshaping of the judicial branch that through across countries, especially in Latin America, but not exclusively. I mean, we can draw examples from the US or from Spain, when the judicial branch is replacing a democratic mandate. So I feel like in many countries, leaders, especially from the left, but are rethinking how to deal with the judiciary. Now in Mexico, we had an answer. We don't know the outcomes of that experiment, but we took that step. So by leaving office, he's essentially inheriting a reshaped political system. So I mean, whether you like it or not, but the effects of Obradorismo will take decades to it will remain for decades. I mean,
I'd like to pick up on what Violeta said and some of what Juan Pablo said as well, of the importance of Obradorismo in showing that political change can actually happen, really, in the real world. You know, I'm a child of the 80s, grew up in the 80s, and really came to kind of political conscience in the 90s, which was a really neoliberal time, as we all know, right? Where the right wing was ascendant, but also that infected the left too. That there was a real kind of a sense on the left that maybe taking power isn't the right way to go, and a real distrust of power, and this idea that nothing can ever come good out of power, right? An absolute skepticism of the use of public power for anything, right? Kind of the postmodern, post-structural, post this, post that we all grew up with, and that was kind of in the air in colleges and universities at the time. So there was just a very sobering article that came out in Jacobin, I think today or yesterday, People in the US, UK have struggled a lot as well. Over the decade of the 2010s, there was Occupy Wall Street and George Floyd and the police brutality and Bernie Sanders once, Bernie Sanders twice, Corbyn in the UK, the fight against Palestine, the student protests now. But it's very sobering to think that the Democratic Party now is to the right of where it was in 2020 and 2016. So what has happened to all of that work in the 2010s? It's sobering. It's not about giving up, but it's just a sobering thought, for those of us who follow the US. Well, Mexico has had its own very difficult time of it, but these 6 years have shown that the use of public power can get us somewhere, and that you can have a program that can then be followed through on, and not just kind of little tweaking around the edges. There's a lot more to do. There's a lot more to do. But some of the things, as Juan Pablo said, we're going to be decades in this. One of the big ones right now is the judicial reform. I mean, the whole federal judiciary is going to be elected now, starting with the whole Supreme Court next year. Imagine if the US could do that with Clarence Thomas and Samuelito getting, VIP trips around the world from people who have business before the court, right? In the US, we feel powerless about doing that, something like that. I feel like we can't do it. It'll never happen. It'll never happen. They'll be there until they die. And then their skeletons will be there for like centuries more. It's just what it seems like. It's like, this idea that, nothing can be done. Mexico has the optimism now, and I think being able to show of something being done and something continuing, right? You can't just win once, you have to win again. You have to build a movement that can continue to win, right? In the US, the Democrats have a habit of when they win the presidential elections, then they blow it and they get wiped out in the midterms. And the whole cycle just goes on inevitably. So I think that's a very important idea, this idea that you have to build power, win elections, win again elections, and create the conditions where you can't be naive in politics. You can't be naive about where the power centers are. And in Mexico, it was very clear that the power centers were in the judicial branch, trying to, lawfare their way, to canceling the 4T, like they've done in other countries in Latin America, and the National Electoral Institute, and these so-called autonomous agencies. You just can't be naive about these things. You have to take the battle on, and you have to take the battle on to where the power centers are. And not to say, oh, we can't do this or that, or the Senate parliamentarian, or, you have to do it. And so I think that's important. I really liked when Alberto Fernandez, the former president of Argentina, came to Mexico, and AMLO kind of gave him a little talking to and said, no puedes estar zigzagueando. You can't be zigzagging in politics. You have to have a path and follow through. And I think that's something that we have to get back. The idea of, yes, gaining power, and the idea of gaining power and then knowing what you're going to do with it.
All right, so I want to be mindful of our guest time and give them an opportunity to say goodbye. But before we do, I want to pass it over to them one last time, just to give us some final words. But before we do that, I do want to read something from López Obrador's parting letter to his party. So López Obrador is retiring from political life. He says he's going to go to his ranch to go and write books. I look forward to reading them. I'm sure all of us will, but he is resigning from the party. He's resigning from public life. He'll probably still comment here and there, but the truth is this is very much the closing of a chapter. But I thought the final words of his letter to the party, to the rank and file of Morena, I think are actually pretty appropriate and a good note for us to end on before I hand it over for everybody to say goodbye. And we'll stick around a little bit to answer the questions. But to quote López Obrador, always put Mexico's interests and the people's needs before personal worries and feuds, strengthening brotherhood, companionship, and institutionality in the party. Always maintain unity, humility, and honesty. Do not allow the old vices and perversions of politics to flourish in our ranks. Avoid arrogance, the search for power's sake, arrogance, corruption, nepotism, and sectarianism. Do not steal, do not lie, do not ever betray the people, and continue to build the sovereign, democratic, just, free, and loving nation that we imagined when we began our walk. So those were the last words that López Obrador delivered for the Morena party membership, the leadership, the incoming president-elect, all of the new governors, the supermajority in the Congress. Important words, which I think in a lot of ways is kind of sums up López Obrador's political life that we made an attempt here to try to sum up here. But I do think that the very famous phrase of his, do not steal, do not lie, do not ever betray the people. That's something to keep in mind. And we hope that the people who are inheriting that mantle of Obradorismo do fulfill on that. So Juan Pablo and then Violeta, some parting words. And Kurt, if you don't mind, we're going to stick around and try to answer some of these questions for the people in the chat who joined us and are watching us live.
Is this like our last intervention or like?
Yeah, I mean, you're more than welcome to stick around, but if you want to say some last words here before we start to try to answer some of these questions from the chat.
I mean, I would leave it in the. I mean, as I was preparing for the podcast, like thinking about this saying of political capital, that I mean, a leader or a president is elected, and you have a given political capital, and you spend that capital in how, like, as much as you can, like, quote unquote, buy. And one thing that it's quite interesting in how Andrés Manuel made politics in his administration as a sitting president was that he invested that capital. So he's leaving office with more capital than what he began with. So I think, I mean, there's like a lot of conclusions that can be drawn from that. And obviously the clearest expression of that is the supermajority and the ability to well, not only change the constitution for change the constitution's sake, but because there's a popular mandate behind that. So I would leave my intervention there, and thank you, José Luis and Kurt, very much for the time, for the privilege to be here and commenting.
Thank you so much, Juan Pablo. It's been a pleasure to hear your analysis as well. And we'll drop some information on our social media in terms of where people can follow your work if people are interested in keeping up with what you're writing about these days. Want to hand it over to Violeta for some last words before we say goodbye and start to tackle these questions here.
Thank you. I would just like to close up with a thought by Chomsky that I used to quote a lot, which is the difference. He says, he talks about the difference not so much between right and left, which of course exists, but another very important difference in public opinion is between those who think that the people can actually decide their own destiny, and those who think they are not able to do that, and that they need to be somehow taken care of by an elite of intellectuals and experts. And these two ways of thinking are present in the left and also in the right. Sometimes we think about, we call populism, you know, that way of thinking by which people actually trust the people to take their destiny into their hands. And I think that the main difference that López Obrador and his movement, or that Obradorismo brings about in opposition to other even leftist movements, is that he has, or Obradorismo has, complete trust in people. The people know what is best for them. The people can decide what is best, what is worst, where is the best place to put the money, where the changes have to be made, etc. And I think this is the real change that we are witnessing. And I also think that this is that Mexico is actually the epicenter of for the following years. I hope it will still be the epicenter of the leftist political thought, but also political action. And I think this is very real, and the main proof is that we are continuing this. That's why we started this podcast saying that this is a bittersweet moment, because on the one hand we are finishing something very important, but on the other hand we're also continuing it. And I think there's also a lot to think about on the matter of how is Claudia Sheinbaum going to continue with this. And I think, my friends, and I'm going to take again of something that Kurt pointed out when he talked about López Obrador telling Alberto Fernandez that zigzagging was not the way. And I would like to just warn our audience about a potential problem that we might confront in the following years, which is, I don't think that Mexico is going to move back to the right. I don't think that's going to happen. But I do think that there is a real danger of going back to center. And by center, I mean this idea that the people don't know better. The people don't know what their destiny should be, and the people cannot take their own problems in their own hands. It must be a group of elite experts who are the ones who will decide. And these experts are totally trustable because they are from the left. But if you think about that combination of ideas, being from the left and also not letting the people decide their own destiny, that is, you can call it the center, but that is actually the way that, the right, the rightist way of thinking comes back. And as Kurt just said, and I also think about this myself. I actually just wrote something about this. There is an ethical mandate of, once the left comes to government, it has the ethical mandate to continue. And I think that that's what López Obrador did very well. And that is what Claudia Sheinbaum now has to continue. And those are going to be my last words for this podcast. And thank you very, very much, José Luis and Kurt, for inviting me. And it was a pleasure to be here with Juan Pablo. It's always, I think we have to get together and talk more about this and maybe write. And I mean, not only the four of us, but everybody is welcome to write about it, because the memory of these days is going to be really hard to pinpoint. But it is a task that we have to do. Okay, so thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Violeta.
Thank you so much. Okay, I wanted to read a little bit from my copy of Gracias here as well, because I think it does kind of capture this. If I had to just my kind of parting words here on the topic that brought us together for this live stream, for this webinar, which is, what is López Obrador's legacy? What can we say about his impact in life? And I think López Obrador is one of those unique politicians that really does have an unrelenting commitment to the people. I think the warning that Violeta gives us just now, I think, is important to pay attention to. We need to always be thinking about how to devolve more and more power into the hands of the people, and always trust that they will make the right decisions. I think there are some who maybe pay lip service to that, but don't actually believe it. And I do think that it's something to watch out for, because that could be ultimately what corrupts from inside this process of transformation, which for me, now at the end of it, with 2 days left in his term, I would definitely say that does rise to the level of the other three transformations that inspired it. The other three political transformations, right? The independence struggle, the reform under Benito Juárez, the Mexican Revolution. I think the revolution of the consciousness, as they said here, revolución de las conciencias, is an accurate descriptor. But on this idea of the commitment to the people, I want to read this last bit from page 508, and I'll translate it real quickly for everybody here. where he says, this is how he closed the speech. So I'm quoting now. And if we ask ourselves, who is our closest ally? What do we answer? The people. Why are we here? For the people. Who should we serve first? The people. Who should we transform with? With the people. Who should we trust? The people. Who protects us? The people. Who are we? The people. I can't hear you. People. Many more times. People, people, faster, louder. People. Long live the fourth transformation. And so that's how he closed a recent demo, really emphasizing that. And I think that's, for me, one of the most important takeaways. The leaders that have kind of transcended the moment that they happen to be in office are the ones that had that commitment. So I do think that that's something to pay attention to, and I have faith in the new leadership, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be vigilant and we shouldn't be active and we shouldn't be part of this process of deepening, of building that second floor, of aiming towards that third floor when that opportunity comes about. So I want to go through the questions here as well. You'll give me a chance here. And Kurt, feel free to jump in anytime you want. We've had a question here about Morena and the drug war. Will there be any chance of movement of Morena put an end to the drug war and much of the pot consumption be legalized? Drug abuse is not a criminal matter. So maybe we start there. Comments on the drug situation, which is obviously something that is often talked about, especially English language media when it comes to Mexico, but often from a very superficial way. So what of Mexico's drug policies now that we're at the end of this term?
Yeah, that's, that's obviously a troublesome area because the drug policy has everything to do with the violence issue in Mexico, right? So the short answer is that legalization is really not on the table right now in Mexico. The Supreme Court, I think, did rule on pot legalization, but that hasn't actually been turned into law. So it's in kind of a gray area there. There's not really a groundswell to legalize in Mexico at the moment. So, drug policy is effectively where it was in that regard, right? There has been, of course, through the social programs, work to outreach to communities to attack the causes, of organized crime and such. But with regards to drug policies as such, that's where that is, right? One of the Scheinbaum policies is to create a national care system. And I would really hope that national care system also has, a space for, seeing drugs as a public health issue rather than a criminal one, right? And giving the care needed to those people who've fallen into that, right? But that's an area where the discourse in the U.S. is at a different place than Mexico. I think that's fair to say, Jose Luis.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it has allowed for a little bit more of a wiggle room in terms of actually putting the key items on the agenda in terms of what is the challenges behind the drug situation, of the misuse and the abuse of drugs, particularly in the United States, which is the number one consumer of that, right? Let's do some rapid fire here, Kurt, because we've been on here for a while now and probably should log off as well. There's a football game waiting for me that needs to be watched. I got a question here from Marco Martinez. Yunus has a really bad reputation in Veracruz. How true is it that he joined Morena? Is it bad for the image of Morena to align with corrupt politicians? We talked a little bit about this on the a podcast a couple of weeks ago. Yunus was the deciding vote in a lot of ways for the constitutional reforms. Now, I would say that it does leave a kind of a bitter taste in my mouth of somebody like that, like the Yunus clan, being affiliated with Morena. But not to be too flippant, but in a lot of ways, art is the art of what is possible, right? And I do think that Morena's leadership made the decision to embrace a figure like Yunus with everything that implies, because it meant passing the judicial reform, which meant destroying one of the remaining conservative strongholds. And then so in the calculus, I think it makes sense that you unfortunately have to ally with certain things like that. He hasn't joined the party. He hasn't been given leadership positions. but his vote is now part of the Morena bloc. In terms of, what are the implications of that in terms of the population? I do think that, as we were saying throughout this program, right, there's is a lot of faith in the masses to understand that they probably also understand that this was a necessary evil, as it were, in order to get the constitutional reform passed. Here's another one on, can you tell me, from Bill Addington, can you tell me why the Mexican government is allowing the proposed Sierra Madre pipeline to connect to the Saguaro LNG facility for export to China? So I don't know much about that particular case, that particular project. I do know, and I'll, Kurt, feel free to jump in on this, right? Mexico is looking to become a major player in the energy markets in the world. So obviously there's the domestic priority of having energy sovereignty, of making sure there's enough electricity capacity, but also energy through carbon, so fossil fuels, oil, gasoline, etc. Rebuilding a new refinery, which is something we actually didn't even mention, something that hadn't happened in decades here in Mexico, replacing the existing refinery. But the idea is for Mexico to be a player in international markets, but also the relationship to China. There is an interest of diversifying who are Mexico's commercial allies, right? We have the benefit of not having to play this geopolitical game of whose side are you on, and if you're with Russia and China, then you're an enemy of the United States. We have a positive relationship with the United States. There are definitely hiccups. There are definitely moments where they overstep their bounds and need to be put back in their place, like we saw with Ken Salazar. But I do think that it is important to keep that relationship, because we do have the number one economy on our doorstep and making the most of it, but not limiting ourselves to that. I think that would be a crucial mistake for the country to make if it put all its eggs in the basket of the United States. And I think it makes sense to be involved in export commodities to other players like China, which is rapidly becoming, if not already, a superpower on the globe. But I don't know much about the specific case, and I'd have to look into it some more. I don't know if, Kurt, you want to jump in on this.
Well, just very briefly, you're absolutely right. It's a proposed pipeline that will go through Chihuahua and Sonora down to the coast. Part of AMLO's energy policy is to reassert more public control over the oil company Pemex and over the Federal Electricity Commission. But he's also said that there is room for private investment in different, in certain energy areas. And one of those is natural gas. The idea is to get the natural gas to the coast, liquefied natural gas, where it can then, be exported, as José Luis properly said, right? For decades, Mexico frittered away its vast energy resources, absolutely frittered them away. And the point is now to, not fritter them away and to actually be able to be present on the world stage, right? And not just, with the United States, as José Luis very properly says. Are pipelines contaminating? Yes, they do. The question is right there, and that's something that has to be addressed as well.
All right, so Eric Tellez asked, something I'm interested in is knowing what Morena's plans are for state and local governments under Morena that need to be more effective than they have been. So we'll start from the agreement from that point that, especially locally, but also in some cases of state level governments, it has not been a good exercise of government. I think there's a big gap in terms of the effectiveness and the popularity of Morena at the federal level vis-a-vis the local level. And I think there hasn't been enough. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about Claudia's address to the Morena Congress, where she does kind of give like a little bit of a wink, specifically speaking to this, that they need to do better. And I think also AMLO's parting words in that letter also speak to this, kind of suggesting that it's necessary to do a better job of governing, of thinking about who you're allying with, just how you're actually exercising power. I think in the case of Puebla, for example, there was a lot of talk of Morena on the campaign trail about reversing the privatization of oil, the privatization of water. Why hasn't that happened? They have every ability to do so, and I think they need to be closer to that. And I think a lot of it does revolve around these concepts that we've been talking about today, around of actually not betraying the people, right? If you promise them that you are going to do X, Y, or Z thing, you have to follow through on it. That's what people evaluate you on. I think López Obrador at the national level certainly did successfully secure many achievements, but there's more to go. Okay, so I have a handful here that I'm going to squeeze in. There's a question on the National Guard. We're going to address that in a future episode. It's too much to kind of get into in a short amount of time. There's a lot to take in there. So my apologies to the people asking that question. We'll get to that in a second. But here's one for you, Kurt. In your opinion, what is the biggest accomplishment of AMLO, and what was his biggest failure?
Well, I think the biggest accomplishment, I think we talked about a lot of them on the program already. I think probably for me, the biggest accomplishment is the Mañanera. I mean, really, the Mañanera and beating back the corporate media vultures. I mean, that's just totally an example, and nothing else would have happened without that, because they would have blocked his government from the first year if he didn't do that. So that was the precondition for everything else. His biggest failure, and I think there's another question about this in the comments, is I think clearly Ayotzinapa. The Ayotzinapa, the disappearance of the 43 normal school students in 2014. Just on Thursday, we just passed the 10-year anniversary of that. Part of AMLO's 100 pledges was that he was going to get to the bottom of Ayotzinapa, and we have to be honest, he didn't. He didn't. And the army is still stonewalling on this. There has been some progress about the over the course of the administration. We know more than we did. We know that what was called the historical truth by the Peña Nieto administration was a pack of lies, right? We know a lot more than we did, but we don't know where besides I think they found 2 bodies. They don't know where the 41 other students are. That was a promise that hasn't happened. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that also on this upcoming episode.
Right on. And of course, we will be having a regular episode this week, so stay tuned. I think it'll come out on Wednesday because obviously Tuesday is Inauguration Day, so we're going to be a little bit busy that day, as you can imagine. As for me, what do I think his biggest accomplishment is? The defense of sovereignty, Soberania. There's a reason why we named the show that. I think in a lot of ways that has allowed us to have the room to operate that's been necessary for other things that I think are also worthy of recognizing in terms of his achievements, which is, like I mentioned on the show, the centrality of class politics, the return of that kind of framework to understand that there is a class struggle and there are class enemies and there is an interest of ruling in the interests of the working class and putting their interests first and facilitating their ability to participate more fully in society, et cetera, et cetera. And I share Kurt's criticisms of the lack of sufficient information in terms of Ayotzinapa. He promised to get to the bottom of it and didn't. And I think Claudia now has to take that on as well. And I hope that her government is able to move further than López Obrador's government was able to on this file. But to give a different answer, I would say migration policy in Mexico was a disappointment for me. I've written about in a column for the Mexico Solidarity Project that, I'm a migrant. I've been migrating since I was a toddler, since we were 2 years old, and all over the place. And I'm more than happy to be here back in Mexico, but I know what that experience is like of trying to resettle, of facing what seem to be insurmountable obstacles for what is something that has been true of humanity since it's been a species, which is human mobility. I do think that there were significant efforts to try to change the conversation, especially in the United States, which is the source of so much of these issues around migration. But unfortunately, we couldn't. Right. Ultimately, I was just watching some football this morning, and the first block of ads was one candidate or another talking about all the drugs and the violence that's coming up through, the U.S. southern border. Obviously, the rhetoric has actually gotten far worse, far more violent, far more dangerous inside of the United States. And we had the Palenque Declaration, where countries from Latin America tried to address this in a made in Latin America kind of solution, but ultimately that didn't make a lot of waves. And to my disappointment personally, in terms of being able to change that conversation, and obviously having to concede a lot, and actually what started out as a very progressive policy of anybody who wanted to have a humanitarian visa could get one, ultimately became one that was quite restrictive. And I possibly even repressive in terms of stopping human mobility through Mexico, and that's been a disappointment. Okay, so going through the questions here. Kurt, your thoughts on Alicia Bárcena's recent participation on the general debate at the UN. Alicia Bárcena is the current foreign minister. She will be the future environment minister, so she's one of the ones who's staying from López Obrador's cabinet into Claudia Sheinbaum's cabinet, although under a different portfolio. Kurt, your thoughts on Alicia?
I thought it was a very good speech. I thought it was a very good speech laying out, Mexican humanism, what's been accomplished, and I think some of what we've talked about in this program. I think it was a good speech and it was well delivered. And I was happy to see it because I've been critical of Biden's lukewarm stance on Israel-Palestine. Right? I mean that's another, I think, a weak point here of this administration. And I was happy to see that. I was happy to see that speech at the UN.
Right on. Okay, so here's a couple of questions that maybe we can lump together. How will Claudia deal with a very hostile U.S. to the point that even Kamala seems to be manufacturing consent for U.S. intervention in Mexico when she explicitly called out the CJNG, las cuatro letras, Sinaloa? And do you think big media companies will reduce their aggressiveness to the incoming president? So these forces from abroad, we have the U.S., the media, conglomerates. What do you think it's going to look like for Claudia now as she's about to begin her term?
The media hostility will continue or will get even worse. And that's precisely because, Mexican conservatives have lost their power centers in the corrupt power centers in the judiciary and some of the so-called autonomous agencies. So they're going to put all their chips even more into the dirty war through the media. So I think that's very clear that is going to continue and probably step up. I also imagine that the rhetoric from either a Trump or a Kamala administration against Mexico will continue to be aggressive. But I think that should not be over-exaggerated from the Mexican point of view because the United States is in a weaker position. The United States is overextended in the Middle East, in Europe, and the Pacific. I think the last thing the United States wants now is to goad Mexico into something. So I think however much the rhetoric runs high in the United States, I don't think the United States is in any kind of position to, invade Mexico or do any kind of that silliness. And I think it's incumbent upon Mexico to not overreact to the rhetoric because the United States is like this big, crazy psychopathic giant batting around all over the world right now. And I think this is the time for Mexico to go for it, to do what it has to do.
Yeah, stand firm. Absolutely agree. And also, in the face of these kinds of attacks, I do think that we're probably going to see an increase. We've seen it recently in the election. We talked a lot about this on the podcast, about the kind of laundered ideas that get filtered through mainstream media of enemies abroad of Mexico's government who are trying to undermine it, this labeling of Claudia as a narco candidate, the labeling of López Obrador as a narco president. I think this stuff is actually going to increase. I think it's going to get worse. I think there is a mistaken assumption, but I think it's out there that Claudia will be weaker or not be able to kind of keep Morena coalition together. And so they're going to be more aggressive. I think they underestimate Claudia every time that comes up. López Obrador said, in comparison, yo soy fresa, right? He's like, I'm bougie compared to Claudia. So be careful about underestimating Claudia Sheinbaum, but I do think that they're operating under that logic and they're going to do it. And in the face of that, everybody who's watching us, I really appreciate you joining in because I think you're going to play an important role. The reason we created this program was precisely to fill in that niche, to fill in that gap in terms of the lack of information about what's happening in Mexico in English, but not because, we want to get our names out there, but because that information needs to be useful to you, the public, so that you can convince your friends and neighbors, so you can engage with your politicians. If there is an escalation of the bilateral relationship, of the tensions, if they really start to take more seriously this notion of a unilateral military intervention, which I do think is a possibility, that you become active, that you become involved and actually resist this because, one part is the U.S. national security doctrine and its various efforts to be the imperialist power on the globe. But I think also, and in the ways that it carries that out, but I think also of it is, they don't want to see Mexico be successful. There's so much about what's happening here that I think many people are viewing as an example to follow. And that means that it's going to look for ways to undermine that, to destroy it, to say, as they say today, right? Oh, if you go down this path, you're going to end up like Venezuela. They would love to turn Mexico into that. If you go down this path, you're going to turn into Mexico in terms of, the economic sabotage that they could unleash on this country, et cetera, et cetera. So all that to say, I think it's very important that there be an active population. And we got a lot of friends of the show who are supporting us. But of course, also all the Mexicans abroad, right? I think you play an important role. It's something that Kurt and I have been trying to emphasize to people inside of the government, that this is important, that you need to be catering your message in English if necessary, like we do here, in order to continue to convince people. All right, we're just at a handful of questions here left. Can you recommend some sources on the 600 assassinated members of the PRD in the early 2000s? So this was the political genocide that was carried out. You have to remember, we didn't get into too much of this, right? But the left in Mexico has gone through a lot of defeats, and some of those defeats have been military defeats, right? There was the 68 democracy movement, which was crushed violently, brutally under the heels of the military. There was the extermination campaign against supporters of the PRD. I mean, the situation now is different, but that doesn't mean that, it can't change, as we've seen coup d'etats in the region in this century. And we know that that could very much be on the agenda for Mexico if we keep proceeding with this deepening, this radicalization of the process. So, Kurt, I don't know if you know off the top of your head.
In English, I don't. It's been very underreported, the history of the early years of the PRD. But you're right. I mean, there's been successive waves of repression against the left, and that was by the Sandinista Gortari regime, when the whole goal was to open Mexico by allying the PRI with the PAN, creating basically the PRIAN, and basically to liquidate the PRD back in those days, to the extent that they could.
All right. Okay. I think we're at the last question here. We have 2 minutes left, so we'll just answer this one here. Eric Deyes asks, can either the PRI or the PAN actually disappear? Yes, the PRD died, but it's not much a prominent party like the PRI or even the PAN. I think I'll leave this to you. You love talking about how the PRI is on its deathbed.
Well, the short answer to that question is yes. Any political party that doesn't meet a 3% threshold in the vote loses its public funding and ceases to be, an active political party. That can happen at the federal level, and that can also happen at the state level, right? So we just saw that happened with the PRD in this election. It didn't hit the 3% level, and goodbye. Which is a shame for what the PRD used to represent, but it was a walking dead party. So at this point, it's better that it just die. Can that happen to the PRIA and the PAN? It's very unlikely it will happen to the PAN. There's always going to be a right-wing party or more, and the PAN is really the right-wing party at this point in Mexico. The PRI, it's not going to happen immediately, but it could. The PRI, I mean, is just a party of the historical corruption and degradation of Mexico. Right? They really have no ideological function in the Mexican political system. We have Morena on the center left. We have the PAN on the right. The PRI is just a historical acronym, and it's just kind of a floater there. I think they're down to about 10% of the vote. So they're still well over the threshold. But I wouldn't discount in another, I don't know, 15 to 20 years if the PRI might cease to exist. That wouldn't surprise me at all. And as that, in turn, there is going to be new parties on the right. Doubtlessly.
All right, so it's 7 o'clock, and we're going to wrap things up here. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I apologize if I didn't get to your question, but we haven't done a live stream of this sort in this style, and I liked it. I don't know about you, Kurt. It was fun to have people interacting with us live. We'll probably do another one. We need to do more of it anyway, so we'll catch you next time if we can get any of your questions addressed in this one. As always, reach out to us. We have our social media, the Mexico Solidarity Media website. We're on YouTube, of course. Give us a like, subscribe if you're not. Tell your friends all about it. Help us get more information about Mexico in English out there. There isn't a lot out there. We're doing our best to try to fill in that gap, and we're going to try to do more and more as we see the need for it. And of course, we do have a regular episode coming out this week. We're obviously going to be talking a lot about the transition as of Tuesday. So the next time you hear from us, Claudia Sheinbaum will be president and López Obrador will be in retirement. So I really appreciate everybody tuning in. Please continue to tune in. I'm José Luis Granados Ceja, Mexican-born journalist living and working here in Mexico City, bringing you an episode of a live Soberania. Kurt, any last words?
We'll see you Wednesday under a new